Hello, and welcome to the next part of our Chapter a Day series working through the book of Genesis. If you've been following along with us, you've been seeing how God has been revealing his nature and his character to humanity through the events and through the stories being portrayed in this book. If you've also been following, you've seen that we've been getting a picture of who we are as human beings, both our intended creation purpose to be the image and likeness of God, displaying his nature and character to the created universe, but also our fallen nature, brought on by disobedience and a desire to be separate from God, and how sin became our master and we became enslaved to it. And we see how our heart attitudes and actions manifest that regularly. We've been following a particular family, and today we find ourselves in Genesis chapter 38 in a very difficult story involving one of the 12 sons of Jacob, now known as Israel, and that is Judah. I have often said in the previous videos that this book is about real stories. This book is about meeting the real God as he interacts with real people in real time. That's one of the things that we see when we read the Word of God, when we read the Bible, compared to other ancient texts and stories, is that these people are real. We can see the character traits in them and see them reflected every day in ourselves and in people around us. We see the positives and the great negatives. We see them played out through human history. No one gets to be whitewashed in this story. So let us look at chapter 38 in Judah. It happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and turned aside to a certain Adullamite, whose name was Hira. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite, whose name was Shua. He took her and went in to her, and she conceived and bore a son, and he called his name She conceived again and bore a son, and she called his name Onan. Yet again she bore a son, and she called his name Shelah. So we have Judah, and we're told that Judah meets this woman, takes her as his wife, and her name is Shua. And together they have sons. So we're told that their first son, his name was Second son was Onan. And the third son was Shelah. Verse 6. And Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. So we're told that Jacob gets a wife for his firstborn. So he arranges the bride price and he finds a wife for his son. Then we come to this interesting descriptor about Judah's firstborn. Verse 7. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. We're not told what that wickedness was. But however he acted out in life, it was an offense to the covenant-keeping God of which he was a part. He was a circumcised part of that covenant. And so God takes his life. God exercises his divine judgment. As we see elsewhere in Scripture, that every person will face death. So God takes his life. And then we come up with this problem, which was part of ancient Near Eastern culture. Verse 8, then Judah said to Onan, go into your brother's wife, perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her, and raise up offspring for your brother. So it was an ancient Near Eastern practice that if the eldest, the firstborn of a household, should pass away without having children, because the line would travel through the firstborn, that the next son was responsible to take his brother's widow, and if they were able to have children, those children would be in the line of the older brother. So if you can grasp this, so we have brother number one. He's the head of the family, okay? And then we have brother number two and brother number three. Brother number one, he will get all the benefits. So he is the heir. You could say the heir to the throne. And his children call them, say, A, would be the next heir. So ironically, as son number one has more sons, son number two and number three get pushed farther down in the rank of succession. It's like if you were watching the British royal family that just celebrated another child being born to Prince William and Princess Catherine. Well, as they have more children, because Prince William is second in line for the throne after his father, Prince Charles, as William has more children, they push William's younger brother farther down the line of succession. They also push Charles's younger brothers farther down the line of succession because of the way the line works. So had no children. So the ancient Near Eastern practice is that his brother is to take the widow and any children that the widow has with him will then move into that first line of succession. So literally what is happening is Onan is being asked to have children to ensure that Onan's position in the line of succession will be pushed down. Now Onan is not a fan of this. He does not want to produce offspring for his brother's line, likely for very practical reasons. At the moment, because Er is dead, Onan, the next brother, is in a position where he can get the birthright. He can inherit the bulk of the inheritance. So Onan is in a very good position right now, unless he follows custom and produces an heir for his brother. And this is we see what he does. Verse 9, but Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. So whenever he went into his brother's wife, he would waste the semen on the ground so as not to give offspring to his brother. So what we see Onan doing is that Onan took his brother's widow, as was the required custom, but whenever they were involved in sexual relations, he made sure that he did not impregnate her. He made sure that he made it impossible for her to conceive. So by all appearances, he is doing what's required of him, but oh look, Tamar is not having any children. Tamar is not having any children. Too bad. I guess I will be the person in the line of succession. Well, what he is doing is both deceitful, and it is also going against the original creation mandate to be fruitful and to multiply, to produce offspring. So there are two things happening here. That Onan is being deceitful to his father. He is being deceitful to his community because he appears to be doing what is expected and what is right in his culture, but in actuality he is not. He's making it impossible for his wife, who wishes to have an heir, to conceive. And so we are told here, verse 10, and what he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. So we see that Onan's practice also brings about God's judgment. So Onan dies as well. Verse 11, then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, remain a widow in your father's house, till Shelah my son grows up. For he feared that he would die like his brothers. So Tamar went and remained in her father's house. Because again, ancient Near Eastern practice would say, okay, well, you still need an heir in the name of the firstborn. So Shelah should now take the widow as one of his wives, or as his wife, if he doesn't have a wife yet, and produce offspring that will become the heir. But Judah is looking at this and thinking, okay, here's the scenario. I had 3 sons. First one was married to Tamar, and then he died. We don't know physically how he died, whether it was an illness or injury or whatever, but he died. Tamar was married to Onan. Onan died. And Judah's thinking, I don't know if I want this connection, because I don't know what's happening here, but this is the only son I have left, and I want to protect this son. So he says to her, you go back to your parents, and because he's still kind of young, and when he's old enough, well then I'll honor our familial contractual agreement, and you will become his wife. So Tamar goes off. But Judah really has no desire to honor this agreement. Verse 12, in the course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. And when Judah was comforted, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, and he and his friend Hira, the Adullamite. And when Tamar was told, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep, she took off her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil, wrapping herself up, and sat at the entrance of Endaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah was grown up, and she had not been given to him in marriage. So Tamar sees the situation. She sees that Judah is dishonoring her. People have said, look, he's grown up. He's old enough to marry. Judah doesn't appear to be doing anything to honor his agreement to you. He is dishonoring you. So here she is. In the culture, she's supposed to marry into the family that she's already been connected to, but she can't because he's not allowing it. Judah's not allowing it. So what happens to Tamar? She's basically stuck in her widowhood. So she, in her humanness, comes up with a plan. And we see this being played out. Remember, these are real people interacting in real time. These are real people. So in this case, we see another example of someone taking matters into their own hands, using their sin-controlled brain to say, how can I work things out for me? When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He turned to her at the roadside and said, "Come, let me come in to you," for he did not know she was his daughter-in-law. She said, "What will you give me that you may come in to me?" He answered, "I will send you a young goat from the flock." She said, "If you give me a pledge until you send it." He said, "What pledge shall I give you?" She replied, "Your signet and your cord and your staff that is in your hand." So he gave them to her and went in to her, and she conceived by him. Then she arose and went away. Taking off her veil, she put on the garments of her widowhood. So we have this moment where here is Judah. He's a widow. He's gone with the sheep shearers. He sees this woman who is veiled, and he decides that, he's going to have sexual activity with her, thinking she's a prostitute. So he goes to her and he propositions her. She, knowing who he is, says, well, what are you going to give me to have a sexual relation with me? And he says, well, I'll give you a young goat. And she says, well, you don't have it right now. I need something right now as proof that you're actually going to do that. And he goes, well, what do you want? And she says, you have a signet, which is probably a roll stamp that he puts on transactions. And I want that. And I want the cord that you have, and I want the staff in your hand. I'll hold on to those until you give me the goat. And he's like, oh, fine. You just hold on to it. I'll have a goat sent right over after we're together. So then he has sex with her, and she conceives. After their interaction, she disappears, takes off her veil, puts on her widow outfit, and she goes away. And watch what happens next. When Judah sent the young goat by his friend, the Adullamite, to take back the pledge from the woman's hand, he did not find her. And he asked the men of the place, where is the cult prostitute who is at Onan at the roadside? And they said, no cult prostitute has been here. So he returned to Judah and said, I have not found her. Also the men of the place said, no cult prostitute has been here. And Judah replied, let her keep the things as her own, or we shall be laughed at. You see, I sent this young goat, and you did not find her. It's interesting here when we see the reference to the prostitute that he's expecting to find. We're told that she was a cult prostitute, which meant that she was one of those of the religious mind that believed that by sexual interaction it became part of the worship of their pagan god. So here is Judah, who should be following the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and here he is going to a pagan cult prostitute, engaging in sexual activity for him simply to satisfy his flesh desires. But in doing so, he's also dishonoring God. He's dishonoring God with his body and his interaction with the prostitute, because he's causing her and him to both enter into a sexual union which is not intended for marriage. But he's also entering into a practice where the practice is intended to worship a pagan deity. So we see exactly where Judah is. Of course, they can't find her because Tamar has gone off now. And he's like, well, let's not press this issue. Let her keep those things. I'll get new ones. You don't want people laughing at us because we're looking everywhere trying to track down this woman because we can't find her. And then we come to verse 24. About 3 months later, Judah was told, Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has been immoral. Moreover, she is pregnant by immorality. And Judah said, bring her out and let her be burned. It's interesting to see what's happening here and even a glimpse of the culture. Judah, the father-in-law of Tamar, was dishonoring her by not giving to her his youngest son. By entering into sexual relations with her, he also dishonors her as a woman. When it's found out that she is pregnant, he wants her punished. He wants her killed. He wants her burned, we're told. This man who was involved in sexual relations outside of any kind of covenant or agreement of marriage with her, he doesn't know it was with her, but with a woman, then turns on her because of what she has done. And we see this is what sin does. Sin gives us optics to see it in others and blinders so we don't see it in ourselves. So he sees something, there's something wrong with Tamar. Tamar was supposed to be saving herself for my son, who I have no intention of giving to her, while not even considering the fact of what he has done sexually. So we come to verse 25. As she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, by the man to whom these belong, I am pregnant. And she said, please identify whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff. Then Judah identified them and said, she is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah. And he did not know her again. So we have this picture here. Again, this very raw story, one of the many that we see in Genesis. So here is this woman who is dishonored and uses that dishonor to prove something to Judah, to show Judah's taking matters into her own hands and all that she seemed to be able to know. She shows Judah what is happening. Gives him a glimpse of his own character. And it's interesting to see how he responds, that he actually responds to what is happening with understanding. She is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah. Verse 27. When the time of her labor came, there were twins in her womb. And when she was in labor, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, this one came out first. But as he drew back his hand, behold, his brother came out. And she said, what a breach you have made for yourself. Therefore his name is called Perez. Afterward his brother came out with a scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was called Zerah. So we see here two more children, two sons that are part of the family of Judah. So he does have more heirs, but the heirs have come now from, instead of them being his grandchildren, they are his own sons, two sons that replace and Onan. It's a hard story when we look at it, when we wrestle with it. because it's a picture of all the challenges, all the consequences of human sin. We have Er, who was wicked in the sight of the Lord, in the sight of the covenant-keeping God. And God brought his life here to an end and brought about judgment. We have Onan, who was wicked in the sight of the Lord and in his actions and in his deception. And he is judged by God. We have Tamar, who is dishonored, and so she uses her own means to show Judah's sin. In the end, we see sons are born to replace those that have been killed, because Judah's line has to continue, because it's also part of the promise. Nation becoming nations, growing in number. So we see God's hand at work in the midst of the mess, because it's a mess here. There's so much here. There's a woman driven to desperation who prostitutes herself with a man to show him what is happening, to show him his betrayal to her. And in the end, he does see it. For you are more righteous than me. But God, through it all, is at work. Even when we don't see it, even when we rebel against it, even when we try to do our own means, even when we're focused on our own self-preservation, God is at work. Think about that today. Think about how you are acting, how we are dealing with things. Are we acting in our flesh? Are we turning to our sin nature? Are we making decisions of how to deal with wrongs in our own way? Or are we seeking God? To reflect at our own lives as we see sin in others, to look closely at our own lives and see, are we reflecting God's righteousness? Or are we not? I encourage you to pray about that today, to consider it as you reflect again on this story of real people and what is happening in their lives. I pray that this also blesses you and in a way can encourage you today of how God can be at work. Thank you, and God bless.